In a blinding snowstorm, a plane can't gain altitude.
The runway felt like an old mud road with potholes that were 2 feet deep, with ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom all the way down the runway.
It slams into a bridge and plunges nose first into frigid waters. On a foggy night, a commuter plane, much too low, crashes in the woods. Only one person survives.
I wasn't in one plane crash. It seems like I was in 10,000 plane crashes because I've had 10,000 nightmares.
Then, a trip for some friends turns tragic when a fire breaks out in flight and an emergency landing goes horribly wrong.
We were up in the air for 1 hour and enjoying our time together. It went from that to sudden terror.
I think it was a very grim situation inside that airplane.
Deadly plane crashes from the few who survive, with dramatic animations that put you up close and inside the troubled cabin. These are the last words from the cockpit of Air Florida Flight 90. The sound of impact is the Tampa-bound Boeing 737 slamming into the 14th Street Bridge in Washington, D.C. and plunging into the icy Potomac River.
It was just before 4, the bridge heavily loaded with commuter traffic, people trying to get home early in a snowstorm.
There is a hole in the ice that looked like someone had taken a baseball and thrown it through a plate glass window. I remember just thinking in amazement, oh my goodness, the plane is underwater with all those people.
Chester Panzer is a cameraman for a Washington TV station. Even before this plane crash, January 13th, 1982 is a busy news day.
We're calling for 5 to 10 inches of snow for the mid-Atlantic states throughout the northeastern states today.
I met my sound man, George Patterson, and we were sent to National Airport, which was closed because of the snow. And all the local TV stations are at the airport doing the same story, talking to people that are stranded. So we shot a story, and the assignment desk told George and I, "Are you guys done for the day?" And we were sitting in traffic about a half hour, 40 minutes, and the assignment desk came on their two-way radio, and they said, "We heard something about a small plane crash at National Airport. We want you guys to check it out." George turned on WTOP, the all-news radio station.
I'm Pam Coulter here along with WTOP Steve Thompson.
What we do know is that an Air Florida 737 jet has crashed into the Potomac River.
Panzer and his sound man make a U-turn and slip and slide their way back toward the 14th Street Bridge, which has 2 spans, one heading south from D.C. into Virginia, the other heading north from Virginia into D.C. By the time the crew gets there and unloads their gear, a United States Park Police rescue chopper, Eagle One, is already on the scene. It's been about 20 minutes since the plane crashed. Panzer quickly aims his camera at the water and catches the rescue of flight attendant Kelly Duncan.
Her dress is all ripped and her stockings, and she's hanging on for dear life.
Panzer shoots several minutes of riveting footage. The improbable rescue of 5 survivors in 34-degree waters. It's a shocking end to a flight that was in the air for only 30 seconds.
The whole deal was like a bad dream.
At the time, Joe Stiley is a private pilot and flight instructor, and as an executive with telecom giant GTE, a seasoned traveler. He's on his way to Tampa with co-worker Nikki Felch. The plane arrives in D.C. from Miami at 1:29 p.m. The plan, to turn around and fly right back to Florida. But the wet, heavy snow is causing major delays.
Everybody was eager to get back to Florida where it was warm, and the snowstorm was basically, it shut down the airport.
9 minutes after the plane arrives at 1:38 p.m., the airport closes down for snow removal. It doesn't reopen until 2:53 p.m. Between 2 and 2:30, passengers and crew board the plane. It is de-iced between 2:45 and 3:10. Then, for the next 49 minutes, it sits outside exposed to the elements. Like other witnesses the NTSB interviewed, Joe Stiley does not recall seeing the crew leave the cockpit to inspect the aircraft.
When they boarded us, I went back and I could see that there had been tracks where they'd brought the baggage up to it, but I saw no indication that any pilot had ever done a tour around the airplane. Of course, those pre-flight inspections are the first thing you teach a student pilot. And I was a little bit, let's just say I had a consciousness about this beginning at that point.
At 3:35 p.m., the pilots review their checklist. The first officer at the controls calls out anti-ice, referring to the plane's internal engine anti-ice system. The captain responds off, a crucial mistake. At 3:40 p.m., the first officer comments, "It's been a while since we've been de-iced," meaning by the airport's ground crew. But the captain does not pick up on the hint or request a second de-icing.
And it was de-iced, but the fluid basically drained off the airplane because they were sitting in a hold for such a long time on the tarmac waiting to take off. And the effectiveness of that fluid degraded to the point where the snow that was still falling started to reaccumulate, and the crew failed to reevaluate what was happening out there.
The snow and ice are causing another grave problem for the plane. There are sensors on the front and back of the engines that measure EPR, engine pressure ratio. That's the number used to set proper takeoff power. But those sensors are iced over, and the pilots don't know it. This causes a false high reading on the EPR gauges in the cockpit, 2.04, which would be enough to take off. Based on that false reading, the first officer believes he's setting the proper power, even though, according to the NTSB report, he sees that the other instruments indicate the EPR reading may be incorrect. At 3:59 p.m., he initiates his takeoff roll. As he accelerates, the plane isn't picking up the speed it needs, but he keeps going.
The runway felt like an old mud road with potholes that were 2 feet deep, with ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom all the way down the runway.
From the cockpit voice recorder, it's clear the first officer is alarmed.
During takeoff run, the first officer repeatedly says, "This is not right."
Instead of telling the captain we should abort, he was basically throwing out hints and hoping that the captain will go, "You know what, you're right. I'm going to do something about it."
They took off with basically 75% power. They also had snow and ice on the wings, which killed some of the lift. The airplane just wasn't going to fly.
While we're going down that runway, I looked over at Nikki on my left side here, and I said, "Nikki, we're in deep trouble," or some word to that effect. And do what I do. And then I put my head down between my knees and my hands up over my head and waited. And I was astonished. We lifted off.
But once the 737 becomes airborne, it's evident there's not enough speed to maintain lift. Coming up, a shocking outcome.
The most telling comment made is, "Larry, we're going down." And the captain says, "I know," and they still don't do anything about it.
January 13th, 1982. Air Florida Flight 90 takes off from Washington National Airport in a blinding snowstorm. The plane is only airborne for 30 seconds when its tail slams into the 14th Street Bridge and it plummets into the Potomac River nose first. 78 people died, 74 from the plane, 4 from cars, and had their roofs sheared off on the bridge.
When I surfaced and I looked around me, I saw orange foam, which was the interior of the walls, insulation in the walls of the aircraft floating around me. I saw that tail and this big airplane that I had been in was totally gone.
The air temperature is 24 degrees, the water 34. Under those conditions, a person will experience exhaustion, loss of coordination and strength, and unconsciousness within 15 to 30 minutes.
When we were standing on the banks of the river, you could see the impact zone on the bridge, and you could see a hole in the ice between the two bridges.
By the time cameraman Chester Panzer starts rolling, passenger Bert Hamilton is already in an ambulance. Flight attendant Kelly Duncan is being lifted out of the water. And a handful of other passengers are still clinging to bits of wreckage. Businessman Joe Stiley, his secretary Nikki Felch, and a young mother named Priscilla Tirado, whose husband and 8-week-old son have perished in the crash.
I think the helicopter crew, Don Usher and Gene Windsor, are trying to figure this out as they go along, doing the best they can.
They dropped 2 lines to me. One of them was just a rope, and the other one had a life ring on it. I put my arm through that life ring, and I grabbed Priscilla Tirado under here, and then I grabbed the other one and tried to simultaneously get hold of Nikki. And they started to pull us away, and almost instantly I couldn't hold my hand on Nikki, so we lost her. And if you look at the footage, you'll see I'm looking back trying to figure out, hey, this is not good. But there was nothing to do. They just kept going.
Stiley tries to hold on to Tirado, but he can't maintain his grip.
I lost her. I couldn't hold on to her. We hit one of those ice things, and she started to slip. I'm in motion, and she's not.
The camera pans back to Priscilla Tirado, who looks as if she's trying to swim, but her body isn't moving. Seconds later, the helicopter rescue team throws down a life ring. Tirado grabs it, but is unable to hold on.
When Priscilla Tirado was in the open water and she lost her grip on the life ring, she was trying to swim on her own. And the impact of the story hit me right then and there. She's going to drown in front of us because she's in the open water. She's got injuries, she's got jet fuel in her eyes, and she's going to drown. And I remember thinking, this is not fair, I should do something.
Because of the snowstorm, all government offices are closed early. A civil servant named Lenny Skutnik jumps into the freezing water just as Priscilla Tirado is starting to go under.
He jumped right over my back to go in after her. Immediately, you know, I remember in the shadow of him going, and then the splash, and watched. Thank God somebody did something.
She definitely would have drowned had Lenny not saved her, so he was a hero for saving her. She just couldn't survive out there.
But Joe Stiley's colleague, Nikki Felch, is still in the water. It's now been about a half hour since the plane crashed. The U.S. Park Police helicopter, flown with expert airmanship by pilot Don Usher, hovers low. Paramedic Gene Windsor, standing on the skids, which Usher has literally put down on the water, reaches out to Felch and pulls her out. He can barely hold on to her as the chopper lifts up and flies her to shore.
She was hanging onto the skids, looking like, you know, she's on, she's off, but she's out of the water. Just hang on to her for dear life and get her to the shoreline.
3 men rush Nikki Felch to an ambulance, but it's already filled with other survivors. So they carry her to a city bus parked nearby.
I remember there was a firefighter there who had a scarf that he was wearing, and I remember him unwinding it off of himself and putting it on her. It was just his way of helping, his way of saying, you know, trying to do what we can.
With 5 survivors now on terra firma, the chopper turns around for one last sweep over the water.
Like one more futile search for survivors.
That is all.
To this day, no one knows why the pilots didn't add power as the plane was falling.
It was totally possible that if they had shoved the thrust levers absolutely full forward, the airplane could have flown out of there. But they didn't, and why has been a subject of speculation since that accident occurred. The most telling comment made is, Larry, we're going down, and the captain says, I know, and they still don't do anything about it.
Coming up, the investigation quickly focuses in on the weather and the mistakes that pile up as the snow comes down.
The captain convinced himself they didn't have a problem.
This accident was waiting to happen at the gate.
Of Air Florida Flight 90, investigators deconstruct the clues to try and piece together what went wrong that wintry Wednesday afternoon. The cockpit voice recorder, the weather, the wreckage, de-icing procedures, every detail is scrutinized. Less than 7 months after the accident, the NTSB issues its final report. Probable cause? The flight crew's failure to use engine anti-ice during ground operation and takeoff. Remember, while going through the checklist, the first officer called out anti-ice, referring to the plane's engine anti-ice system, and the captain responded, off.
And that's on the cockpit voice recorder, so we pretty well knew that the probes were iced up, and that explained why they were getting improper indications on their engine pressure ratio gauges.
And they're so used to not having to use engine anti-ice on the ground that, as a matter of habit, they didn't select it on, but more importantly, they didn't catch it with the checklist.
2 other factors are cited as probable cause. The flight crew's decision to take off with snow and ice on the airfoil surfaces of the aircraft, meaning the wings, horizontal stabilizer, any component producing lift. And the captain's failure to reject the takeoff early on, when the first officer tried to make him aware of the problematic EPR readings. The cockpit voice recorder does show the first officer tried to raise a red flag.
Clearly, the first officer was saying something's not right here. And due to confirmation bias and what the captain wanted to see, he convinced himself they didn't have a problem. And when he did that, he basically dismissed the inputs from the first officer. That's the single largest failing that I see out of this captain.
This accident was waiting to happen at the gate. It should have never happened. It was a prescription for disaster because it was one after another in the sequence of events that led to a catastrophe.
Among the contributing factors cited by the safety board, the prolonged ground delay between de-icing and takeoff clearance, during which the airplane was exposed to continual precipitation, and the limited experience of the flight crew in jet transport winter operations.
The majority of their experience was in the southeast part of the United States. So for this crew to go into Washington National in January and be exposed to heavy, wet snow really put them in a detrimental situation.
Years later, there's a similar crash in New York.
According to New York City police, at least 8 people have died in that plane crash.
U.S. Air Flight 405 stalls trying to take off from LaGuardia due to ice contamination on the wings. The 2 tragedies are a wake-up call to the industry.
As a result of Air Florida 90 and U.S. Air 405, the entire way that we deal with ground icing events and the de-icing of aircraft has changed significantly. We used improved fluids, different fluids, additional fluids, and we developed very carefully constructed holdover tables so that pilots know the amount of time that they have in their conditions between the de-icing and the time that they need to initiate takeoff roll. I would say that the likelihood of an Air Florida 90 type accident occurring today is extremely low.
Coming up, a small turboprop slams into the woods in Maine. 17 people die. Only one survives. His dramatic story.
This is the end of the line for Flight 46 right here. It is a feeling that you'll never forget. It'll be with you the rest of your life.
This plane is about to crash. 17 people are going to die. But one person will survive the ordeal of a lifetime.
Any idea how he got out of that thing alive?
Miracle. I have no idea how he got out.
The sole survivor, John McCafferty, is now in his 50s, still living in his native Maine. For the union pipe fitter, the crash of Down East Airlines Flight 46 is as vivid today as the day it happened. He was 16 years old, heading back home from a trip to Florida.
It was May 30th, 1979. I landed in Logan around 11:30 in the morning, and I was supposed to have a short layover, and because of weather conditions, the plane that was flying down from Owl's Head, Maine was delayed.
Upon arriving in Boston, the de Havilland Twin Otter is supposed to turn right back around and return to Maine. But John McCafferty recalls overhearing a phone conversation in which a crew member expresses concerns to a company official.
He described how the weather was not, favorable, and also he was concerned because he was saying that he had valve trouble in his right engine.
The plane is scheduled to land at the Knox County Regional Airport in Owl's Head, Maine, near Rockland, right off the Atlantic Ocean. The company's certified weather observer in Rockland says the sky is obscured by fog in the area with 3-mile visibility. The pilots don't want to fly, and they're not the only ones with nagging doubts.
As I looked up at the plane, I had a feeling overcome me, and I knew in my heart that this plane was going to crash. I just had an overwhelming feeling.
At 7:55 p.m., the plane takes off for the 1-hour flight. It's turbulent. Halfway through, the pilots request updated weather information. They're told visibility is down to 3/4 of a mile, and conditions are deteriorating.
The pilot came on the intercom and made an announcement that we were approaching the Owl's Head Airport and that we would be landing within a few minutes.
But as the plane descends into Rockland, visibility is extremely limited. With moist air coming in off the Atlantic, the area is prone to low clouds and fog. Because of this, expert analysis suggests the pilots are unable to see the airport. Flight 46 tells air traffic control they're probably going to have to miss the approach at Rockland, meaning abort the landing. They request a clearance at Augusta, a nearby airport. But it's too late.
The pilots obviously saw the same thing that I saw. They saw the trees coming up real fast. They knew that they were in a bad position. I do remember hearing the engines come on to full power, and I know that the pilot tried to pull out of it because the front end of the plane did lift a little, but that's when we hit the first tree.
The comments by the passenger about the application of power would be completely consistent with what the pilots would do. The fact that they're interacting with increasing diameters of trees is robbing the airplane of speed and, as a result, lift. they're going to continue to settle unless they can accelerate and get more lift. Unfortunately, for Down East 46, it didn't happen.
I put my hands on the seat in front of me, and I put my knees up in the back of the seat into what I would call a crash position. And all of a sudden, we hit the first tree, and it made a real loud crash and bang. You could hear metal crushing, and people were screaming. My body was flying forward through the plane, and then the plane suddenly came to a stop.
McCafferty realizes he's the only survivor. Soaked in jet fuel and terrified the plane is going to blow up, he manages to crawl away.
Roughly 75 feet in this direction is where I finally came to rest, and I laid there just waiting for help, and then finally a team did arrive, and they came to the wreckage first over here, and I could hear people's voices, and I saw flashlights, and I hollered out at the top of my lungs at that time, "Help, I'm over here." This is one of the trees that the plane hit on the crash path.
On a snowy winter day, John McCafferty revisits the crash site for the first time in 35 years. With him, Foster Sullivan, one of the first responders who helped save his life.
I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "John." He said, "Tell my parents that I love them and I'm going to heaven."
I wanted them to know that, you know, if I was to die, which I honestly thought I was going to, that I would be in heaven and that I did not suffer.
His pulse rate was so high I couldn't take it. Low blood pressure. His abdomen was distending. I knew that he was coming to the end. He shouldn't be here today. He should be gone.
McCafferty is critically injured. He's taken to the hospital where he spends more than a month recuperating from his injuries. It's now left to the NTSB to get to the bottom of what caused this deadly crash. The morning after the accident, air safety investigator Dr. Al Deal arrives with a GO team.
We overflew the wreckage. We saw it was a horrific impact, and I certainly was amazed that there was even one survivor because the plane hit very violently, nose down into the wooded area.
Deal has a bad gut feeling about Down East Airlines from day one when he meets Phil Simpson, chief inspector for the Maine Aeronautics Commission.
He said, "I want to talk to you about this accident privately." And I said, "Great. I've got to run out to photograph the wreckage right now. Then I've got to get over to the morgue, and I will speak with you tomorrow."
At the morgue, Deal's suspicions are further aroused when he asks the medical examiner for the captain's flight records.
And he said, "Oh, somebody from the airline already showed up, and they got the papers." I said, "Excuse me, you've got to treat these bodies like they're part of a crime scene. Do not release anything from the bodies except to the federal government."
Deal says his suspicions are confirmed when he pays a personal visit to the Down East offices and asks the airline's owner to show him those papers.
And he said, "Oh, they were all bloody, and I burned them." Right then, alarm bells went off. Somebody's destroying evidence, and the bodies are still warm. So I met with the commissioner the next day, and he handed me an NTSB accident report of an accident that Down East Airlines had 8 years before, a fatal accident, very similar circumstances. And he said to me, "Are you going to do like the NTSB guys did at this last accident, spend a few days, go home and write your report and declare pilot error?" And I said, "No way, Mr. Commissioner. We're going to get to the bottom of this."
Coming up, the NTSB investigator digs deeper, and he doesn't like what he sees.
Something was very wrong with this airline.
We heard this bang and the thump on the roof of the cabin, and then the plane seemed to go off.
On a cold, foggy night in May 1979, Down East Airlines Flight 46 crashes in a wooded area of Owl's Head, Maine. "17 of 18 aboard the small commuter plane are killed instantly. One heartbreaking photo shows the pilot's young son surveying the wreckage. The sole survivor is 16-year-old John McCafferty. He's badly injured.
I had fractured ribs, I had a punctured lung, I had my scalp torn from my head. It took 580 stitches to sew my scalp back on. I took a real beating in that airplane crash.
While McCafferty is recuperating, NTSB investigator Dr. Al Deal is with the GO team in Maine, digging to find out what caused the accident. But in the process, he finds there's much more to the story.
The hair was standing up on the back of my neck that something was very wrong with this airline.
Over the next year, 14 former Down East pilots and other employees provide written statements and/or sworn testimony to the NTSB, laying out 23 alleged unsafe company practices. And they describe a troubling work environment. Jim Merriman, the captain of Flight 46, also serves as chief pilot for Down East Airlines. Colleagues describe him as feeling, quote, under pressure constantly from the airline president. That man, Robert Stenger Sr., declined our request for comment. In the weeks leading up to the accident, Captain Merriman's family says the pilot was suffering a loss of appetite, exhaustion, preoccupation, chest pains, and breathing difficulties.
He was probably suffering a kind of PTSD, and he was also very fatigued because he was in charge of training all these pilots. And the people that they were hiring were really rookies that needed to be very carefully watched.
Worried about the weather and a malfunctioning engine, Merriman and his first officer make it clear they do not want to fly that night. But they take off anyway. The NTSB report suggests the crew may have feared losing their jobs if they didn't. In the report, employees describe the president's explosive temperament, which created an atmosphere of hostility, intimidation, and a fear of loss of employment.
The fear of commercial retaliation, if you will, that does not override the airman's responsibility to make the necessary decisions. Is the flight unsafe? No. We have fuel on board, we have instrument procedures, we have an alternate airport that meets the criteria. This is not an unsafe flight. If it were, the captain has an absolute responsibility to refuse it. He did not.
One former pilot we spoke to says he did refuse to fly on more than one occasion. He says he was fired by Down East owner Robert Stenger 4 times and rehired within 20 minutes each time. He and other pilots report being pressured, ridiculed, and intimidated on a regular basis and urged to cut corners. The president of the airline and a few other Down East employees deny they ever ordered pilots to violate operating requirements. The company denies the allegations in the report and offers explanations. The NTSB lists probable cause as the failure of the flight crew to arrest the aircraft's descent at the minimum descent altitude. One of the 23 allegations laid out by the pilots was that Down East established minimums below those mandated by the FAA.
They descended below the minimum altitude before they saw the runway, and as a result, they ended up short of the runway into trees, resulting in the accident.
The safety board concludes that company pressures, inadequate crew training, the first officer's limited experience and weak instrument flying ability, and the captain's job-related stress resulting in chronic fatigue were all factors in the accident.
This is the end of the line for Flight 46 right here. I pray for all the souls that were on board, and I hope the families can somehow find peace someday, even though it's difficult for them.
It isn't until 1995 that the FAA begins regulating small carriers the way it does large airlines. Before that, accidents like this plagued commuter airlines. For John McCafferty, the plane crash he survived will haunt him for the rest of his days.
I wasn't in one plane crash. It seems like I was in 10,000 plane crashes because I've had 10,000 nightmares. It's crazy.
The memories are just as haunting for first responder Foster Sullivan.
There's a silence to this place, very quiet. That brings back memories of that crash. When we walked in, everything was so silent. This is the last time I'm coming here. For me, I need to lay this to rest in my mind. It's done.
Coming up, an in-flight fire, a treacherous crash, 4 fatalities, and one single amazing story of survival.
When you're burning, you don't feel it because you are a survivor in that moment.
Crashes and burns in a Kansas cornfield. It's a tragic turn of events for these young friends, including recent Oral Roberts University graduate Hannah Luce.
It was May 11th, 2012. It was an ordinary day, just like any other day. We were headed from Tulsa, Oklahoma to Council Bluffs, Iowa.
They're heading to a Teen Mania Ministries event organized by Luce's evangelist father, Ron. The friends could drive, which would take them about 6.5 hours. But one of them knows a licensed pilot who offers to fly them, which would only take about 2 hours. At 3:45 p.m., the red, white, and blue Cessna 401, tail number N9DM, takes off from the Richard Lloyd Jones Jr. Airport in Tulsa.
We were up in the air for 1 hour and enjoying our time together, and there's a high energy.
It's chilly in the plane, so the pilot turns on the cabin or combustion heater. It gives off a foul odor, so the pilot shuts it off. Then, moments later, at about 8,000 feet, something terrifying happens. There's a fire. Dark smoke starts filling the cabin.
You hear a lot of coughing. We're trying to figure out how to survive in this situation.
The pilot has no choice. He has to make an emergency landing. They're about 1/3 of the way to their destination. The plane is over Chanute, Kansas.
I remember looking outside of the window as I'm trying to cover my face to block the smoke with my blouse.
This type of airplane, because it's not pressurized, does not have the goggles and the oxygen available that an airliner would have that flies at high altitude. I think it was a very grim situation inside that airplane.
At 4:30 p.m., the Cessna slams into the ground. The right wingtip is the first point of impact, causing the plane to cartwheel.
You couldn't see anything past your hand because the smoke was so thick.
3 of the 5 people on board are killed instantly. Luce and her friend Austin Anderson, a 27-year-old former Marine, are alive but badly injured. They managed to walk to a road and flag down help. Anderson, burned over 90% of his body, dies the next morning. Luce, burned over nearly 30% of her body, is the sole survivor. NTSB investigators quickly zero in on what caused the crash. 2 weeks before the accident, the same pilot got an overheat warning in the same plane. The heater shut down without incident that time. Logbooks show the heater was inoperative during the plane's most recent annual inspection. Probable cause? The malfunction of a cabin heater, which resulted in an in-flight fire and smoke in the airplane. That's the same thing that led to the 1985 crash of a DC-3, which killed singer Ricky Nelson, son of Ozzie and Harriet.
Combustion heaters in airplanes have a history of causing problems. They can cause in-flight fire. In some cases, they cause carbon monoxide poisoning. It doesn't matter if it's your own personal airplane or if it's an A380. If there is a known mechanical malfunction, maintenance has to be performed and the airplane determined to be airworthy.
This was a known malfunction with an aircraft and an aircraft system, and that multiple people had looked at it, the pilot was aware of it. You never want to fly or conduct an operation, especially with a known malfunctioning piece of equipment, such as a heater. This pilot should have never taken that airplane on that flight.
We're all survivors. We all have pain. Pain is pain. We all struggle. And as much as my struggles are very drastic, so many people across the world are experiencing so much worse than I ever did.
It's a rare occurrence for planes to crash, 1 in 1.2 million flights to be exact. When commercial planes do crash, the chances of surviving are better than you might think. 95% according to the NTSB. And for those wondering where the safest place is to sit on a plane, there are no significant statistics. But pilots say the smoothest ride is usually over the wing. For those who survive deadly plane crashes, the experience can't help be anything but life-changing.
My son celebrates his birthday and my survival on the same day, and I have lived to see all my children grow up.
To go through something so horrific and survive it, especially considering the wounds that I had, I realized that God had a hand in that, and I have thanked him ever since.